All right, let's take a look at gas exchange for chapter 23. This is continuing. In chapter 23, we just talked about the lung volumes and how the air moves in and out. So now we're going to just continue and talk about, well, how is the gas that comes with the air, the oxygen, how's that going to be exchanged? Or how does the gas that's in the blood already, the CO2, how's that going to be exchanged at the air, at the alveolus? There we go. Okay, so we're back to this diagram and we've looked at pulmonary ventilation already. So that was the last video. Now we're going to look at gas exchange. Gas exchange happens in two different places, at the alveoli and in your body's tissues elsewhere in the body. So what's going to happen here, just in general, the CO2 from your body's tissue is going to move into the alveoli when we're doing alveolar gas exchange. So, you've got blood with CO2 and it's going to be coming from all over your body's tissues. When you do metabolic reactions, CO2 is a waste product, and then you have to get rid of that CO2. So it's going to push the CO2 all the way in the veins to the lungs, and that's when it's going to then be offloaded, or it's going to come out of the blood and go into the alveoli, into the air in your lungs, and then you will exhale it. And then you're also kind of at the same time, you're bringing in that air through pulmonary ventilation, and it's got lots of oxygen in it. So the oxygen is going to move into the blood. So from the alveolus into the blood, that's alveolar gas exchange. So from CO2 from the blood into the alveoli, or oxygen from the alveoli into the blood, that's alveolar gas exchange. And then the opposite is happening down here with systemic gas exchange. You just keep following it around and around and around. So that blood with the oxygen is going to go to the body's tissues, and you're going to take the oxygen from the blood and exchange it to your systemic cells for the CO2 that they produced. And now the CO2 hops into the blood. So that's our overview. We'll look at these using this picture, 2325. And what we're looking at here is your pulmonary circulation and systemic circulation that we learned about in the blood vessel chapter. Pulmonary circulation is, moving the blood from the heart to the lungs and back, and systemic circulation is moving the blood from the heart to the body's tissues and back. When you look at what's happening here in the lung, like I said earlier, this is alveolar gas exchange. We're going to take a closer look at this picture, but it involves that respiratory membrane that I talked about in the first video. When you look at what's happening in the capillaries at your body's tissues, this is systemic gas exchange. And it's not called a respiratory membrane here because we're not in the lung, but you are going to have tissue cells and capillaries and a membrane that you have to cross there, a couple membranes actually. All right, so let's look at the first part of this. My dogs are sleepy. Sorry, they're yawning. You've got, this one is the alveolar gas exchange because we can see the respiratory membrane here. Looking at this, some things to review before we move on is that partial pressure. That's when you see the P in front of O2 or the P in front of CO2, and that's going to be different. The oxygen has a different partial pressure than the CO2 has. Different gases have different partial pressures just by definition. So the P of the O2, the partial pressure of the O2, is just the pressure that just one gas, that oxygen, exerts in the mixture. And then your PCO2 is just how much pressure the CO2 is exerting on the mixture. So they're going to be different numbers, and you can see that they're different in this box here and in these boxes over here. So that's your PO2 and PCO2, just partial pressures. And then you have the partial pressure gradient, which I talked about a tiny bit already, and that's going to be the partial pressure for a gas is going to be higher in one area than it is in another. That's just a definition of a gradient, that there's a difference. It's higher in one place than it is in another. So since this is a partial pressure gradient that we're talking about, it means that the pressure for this gas, let's take oxygen for example, the pressure is lower in one place and higher in the other. So that is definition of a partial pressure gradient. And you can see there, those two numbers are really different. So that's a really strong gradient. You can see that there's different numbers here for the PCO2. They're not as different, but they're still different. So there's still a gradient. It's just a smaller gradient, or a less steep gradient is how we refer to that. So the example here, like I just showed you, is that the higher PO2 is in the alveoli than it is in the blood when you're at the lungs. So if you look at this picture, you've got high partial pressure of the oxygen in the alveolus, 104. You certainly don't need to memorize these numbers. But if I gave you the numbers, be able to figure this out. What's going to go where? You've got a low partial pressure of oxygen in this pulmonary capillary. So remember, things are going to go from high to low to follow the gradient. So that means that our oxygen is going to follow the pressure gradient, and it's going to go from the alveolus into the blood, from a high pressure to the low pressure. And the opposite's going to be true for the CO2, because you have a little bit higher CO2 in the blood, because that's that blood that came from all over your body, your tissues, and it's picked up CO2 along the way. So you've got a higher concentration of CO2 there. And there's less CO2 in your alveolus. So you're going to send the CO2 from high to low into the alveolus. So they're just moving in opposite directions because their pressure gradients are opposite of each other. All right, that is how the respiratory gases are exchanged. High to low pressure, but each gas follows its own pressure gradient. So at the alveolus, it's this direction. If you, well, let's talk a little bit more about this before we move on from the alveolus. The solubility of the gas is going to depend on that partial pressure. It also depends on the type of gas. And if you take a chemistry class, you get into lots of details about this, but the basics are that some gases dissolve better than others, and some dissolve better than others in liquids. So what you need to know here is that CO2 is more soluble than oxygen. Got to remember that. Therefore, a lower pressure gradient is required for its exchange. That's why you're able to get enough of that CO2 moving into the alveoli from the blood. You don't need a high pressure gradient here because the CO2 is more soluble than the oxygen is. And the opposite is true for the oxygen. The oxygen is less soluble, so you need a higher concentration gradient in order for it to move into the blood from the alveolus. All right, so let's take a look at this. We were just talking about this alveolar gas exchange. That is the external gas exchange, and that's because it's from the outside of your body and the inside of your body doing the gas exchange, external respiration. And then your internal respiration has to do with your systemic circulation, and that's going to be your systemic gas exchange there. So let's look at gas transport in the next video, I think.